The German intelligence report filed from the Scheldt estuary in October 1944 contained observations so bizarre that senior Wehrmacht officers initially dismissed it as exaggeration, born of combat stress or deliberate misinformation. The Canadian units attacking through the flooded polders and fortified positions were continuing offensive operations with undiminished intensity, despite confirmed disruption of their supply lines that had left forward battalions without food for multiple days. German commanders who had fought across Europe understood that hunger degraded combat effectiveness rapidly, that soldiers denied rations, lost strength and morale within 72 hours, and became combat ineffective within a week. Yet the Canadians kept attacking with ferocity that suggested full stomachs and high morale, pushing through defensive lines that should have held against weakened troops. The contradiction between observed performance and expected degradation from starvation created cognitive dissonance among German officers trained to calculate combat power based on logistics. Either the intelligence about disrupted supply lines was wrong, or the Canadians possessed capabilities that defied conventional military wisdom about the relationship between nutrition and combat effectiveness. The Scheldt campaign represented a critical operation in the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces struggled to open the approaches to Antwerp. The massive port, whose capture intact in September, had promised to solve logistics problems plaguing the advance toward Germany. The port itself sat useless, while German forces controlled both banks of the 50-mile estuary, connecting Antwerp to the North Sea, their coastal batteries and fortified positions making the waterway impassable to Allied shipping. The task of clearing these defenses fell primarily to the 1st Canadian Army, a formation that included Canadian, British, and Polish units under Canadian command. The operational environment could hardly have been worse, as the Dutch lowlands had been deliberately flooded by German engineers, creating a nightmare landscape of water, mud, and isolated patches of high ground where defenders had concentrated their positions. Fighting in such conditions demanded extraordinary physical endurance, even with adequate food and rest. Yet the Canadians would be forced to sustain operations while supplies failed to reach forward units trapped in battles that allowed no pause for resupply. The German defenders occupying positions along the Scheldt included veteran formations that had survived years of combat on the eastern and western fronts. They understood the value of the ground they held and the strategic importance of denying the Allies use of Antwerp. Their commanders, seasoned professionals who had studied logistics and combat effectiveness throughout careers spanning 2 world wars, knew that attacking forces required enormous material support to sustain offensive operations against prepared defenses. The calculations were straightforward. Soldiers needed approximately 3,000 calories daily to maintain combat effectiveness, more in cold, wet conditions that characterized the Scheldt in autumn. Units cut off from supply for extended periods would inevitably lose combat power through starvation, regardless of training or morale. This understanding informed German defensive planning as they worked to disrupt Allied logistics through artillery interdiction of supply routes, hoping to starve the attacking Canadians into operational paralysis. What the German planners failed to account for was the unique character of the Canadian forces they faced and the institutional culture that had developed through years of fighting in the worst conditions the war offered. The 1st Canadian Army had evolved far beyond its 1,939 origins as a small professional force, augmented by enthusiastic but inexperienced volunteers. By 1944, it represented a hardened formation that had fought through Italy and northwestern Europe, developing tactical excellence and mental toughness through campaigns that had tested and eliminated those who could not adapt. The soldiers manning forward positions in the Scheldt polders were survivors of Sicily, Ortona, the Liri Valley, and the Normandy breakout. They had endured artillery barrages, close-quarters urban combat, river crossings under fire, and the grinding attrition of fighting skilled defenders on ground of their choosing. This experience had forged units capable of functioning effectively under conditions that would have broken less experienced formations. The supply crisis that would define the Scheldt campaign for Canadian forward units began not through German defensive success, but through the inherent difficulties of operating in flooded terrain where conventional logistics collapsed. Roads that existed on maps lay underwater or had been cratered by demolitions, forcing supplies to move forward on small boats, amphibious vehicles, or human backs along narrow causeways swept by German artillery. The tonnage that could reach forward battalions dropped precipitously as the advance pushed deeper into the flooded zone, creating widening gap between what units needed and what logistics could deliver. Ammunition received priority over food because battles could not be fought without bullets and shells, meaning rations were often the first item cut when transport capacity proved insufficient. By the second week of October, some Canadian companies had been reduced to quarter rations, then to scavenged food from abandoned buildings, and finally to nothing, as they fought continuously through positions where no supplies existed and no break in combat allowed foraging. The question facing these units was simple and terrible. Could they continue fighting effectively while starving, or would hunger accomplish what German defensive fire had not, by reducing the attackers to ineffectiveness? The initial days of reduced rations passed with complaints, but without serious degradation in combat effectiveness, as Canadian units drew on institutional discipline and personal resilience built through previous hardships. Soldiers had experienced supply disruptions before during the Italian campaign, where mountain warfare often meant carrying everything needed on backs up slopes that broke men and mules alike. They understood that combat rarely provided the convenience of hot meals and regular rations, that infantry work demanded functioning effectively while cold, wet, exhausted, and hungry. The professional non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of Canadian units maintained standards and drove their men forward through leadership that balanced demands for performance with concern for welfare. When rations dropped to half and then quarter portions, these sergeants ensured that what food existed was distributed fairly and that men understood the situation honestly rather than being fed comfortable lies about imminent resupply. By the fourth day of severely restricted food, physical effects became impossible to ignore, as bodies that had been burning calories at extraordinary rates in cold water and constant combat began consuming themselves for energy. Soldiers noticed weakness in their limbs, trembling hands that made fine motor skills difficult, and the gnawing emptiness in stomachs that had progressed beyond hunger pangs to constant dull ache. Sleep provided no relief because exhausted bodies demanded calories for repair that were not available, leaving men to wake more tired than when they had collapsed into whatever shelter they could find. Wounds healed slowly or not at all, as bodies prioritized immediate survival over repair processes, turning minor injuries into ongoing problems that sapped strength further. Yet despite these mounting physical costs, the Canadian units continued attacking with aggression that startled German defenders who had expected weakening resolve. The psychological warfare aspects of fighting while starving manifested differently than German expectations predicted. Rather than inducing defeatism or desire to surrender, hunger became another hardship that fueled anger and determination among men who had already endured so much that additional suffering simply reinforced existing attitudes. Canadian soldiers developed grim pride in their ability to keep fighting despite conditions that would have justified retreat or defensive postures. Unit cohesion strengthened rather than fraying as shared suffering created bonds between men who watched comrades push forward on empty stomachs and knew they must do the same. The officers and sergeants who led attacks did so while as hungry as their men, refusing privileged access to whatever food existed and earning respect through shared deprivation. This leadership approach maintained morale even as physical strength diminished. German defensive positions across the Scheldt polders depended heavily on the protection offered by flooded terrain that channeled attackers onto narrow causeways and patches of high ground, easily covered by prepared fire positions. Machine guns sighted to sweep approaches, artillery registered on every avenue of advance, and minefields, covering the few routes through the water, created killing zones that should have stopped any assault regardless of attacker determination. The Germans had built these defenses expecting to hold for weeks or months, confident that the combination of terrain and firepower would break Allied offensive capability. What they had not anticipated was facing attackers so driven by accumulated rage and stubbornness that they pressed attacks in the face of casualties that should have triggered withdrawal. The Canadians came through water sometimes chest deep, wading slowly forward, while machine gun fire kicked up spray around them, climbing onto causeways where comrades fell but continuing forward. Because stopping meant dying, and advancing meant possibly living. The hunger gnawing at their guts became just another discomfort beneath the more immediate concerns of bullets and shells. By day 7, without food, Canadian forward companies had been reduced to shadows of their authorized strength through combination of casualties and physical exhaustion that finally began affecting combat capability in measurable ways. Men who had functioned on adrenaline and determination now moved with visible effort. Their reactions slowed, and their strength barely adequate for tasks that had been routine days earlier. Lifting and throwing grenades required concentration. Climbing from water onto land demanded multiple attempts, and simply staying alert during brief rest periods became nearly impossible as bodies desperate for calories tried to shut down and conserve energy. Medical personnel working in forward aid stations reported treating soldiers for exposure and exhaustion symptoms that bordered on life-threatening cases where men had pushed so far beyond normal limits that their bodies were beginning to fail in fundamental ways. Yet even in this condition, the Canadians refused to yield ground or accept defensive postures, continuing to press attacks against German positions with ferocity born from determination that hunger would not achieve what enemy fire had failed to accomplish. German observers watching these attacks filed reports describing enemy troops who appeared half dead but fought with undiminished violence, a phenomenon that violated everything professional soldiers understood about the relationship between physical condition and combat effectiveness. The crisis point arrived on day 9, when Canadian forward positions faced German counterattack by reserve formations, moved forward to exploit what German commanders assumed would be weakened defenses held by starving troops incapable of German commanders. Sustained resistance. The counterattack plan was sound in theory. Strike along the extended Canadian flanks where logistics would be most strained, use fresh troops to overwhelm defenders too weak from hunger to mount effective response, and drive wedges through the line that would force general retreat from positions that had cost so much to take. German assault troops moved forward, confident they faced an enemy at the breaking point, ready to collapse under determined pressure applied at the right moment. What they encountered instead was a nightmare of close-quarters violence delivered by men who should have been helpless but fought like wounded animals, cornered and refusing to die quietly. The Canadian defensive response to German counterattack revealed capabilities forged through years of combat experience that hunger could diminish but not eliminate. Officers and sergeants who had fought defensive battles before recognized the pattern of German assault tactics and positioned their reduced forces to maximize effectiveness of available firepower. Machine guns covered likely approaches, while riflemen concentrated at critical points, rather than spreading thin across entire sectors. The Canadians had learned through bitter experience exactly where and how to fight outnumbered, using terrain and prepared positions to multiply combat power beyond what manpower alone suggested. When German infantry appeared, advancing toward positions held by men who had not eaten in over a week, they walked into carefully prepared kill zones, where hunger did not prevent Canadian gunners from operating weapons they could fire, with eyes closed and fingers that knew every mechanism through muscle memory developed over years. The hand-to-hand fighting that erupted when German assault troops reached Canadian positions became legendary in accounts filed by survivors on both sides, who struggled to describe the ferocity of combat between men locked in, struggles where quarter was neither asked nor given, Canadian soldiers too weak to throw, grenades far still swung, entrenching tools and rifles with desperate strength, born from understanding that losing this fight meant death after everything they had already survived. German attackers expecting to overwhelm weakened defenders found themselves in brutal, close combat against opponents who fought with rage, accumulated through days of hunger and years of war. Men grappled in flooded shell craters and across muddy parapets, stabbing with knives and bayonets when ammunition ran out, clubbing with rifle butts and rocks when weapons broke, and in some cases simply choking and drowning each other in water too shallow to submerge a body, but deep enough to kill a man held under by someone stronger or more desperate. The violence transcended tactical considerations to become something primal and terrible, combat stripped to its essence where survival depended on willingness to inflict and endure trauma that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. German commanders, directing the counterattack, watched in disbelief as reports arrived, describing attacks failing against resistance that should not have existed. Fresh battalions stumbled back from positions they had expected to overrun easily, their casualties shocking and their morale shaken by encountering defenders who simply refused to be beaten despite every logical reason suggesting they should collapse. The German officers filed urgent requests for reinforcements and air support to continue operations that had been planned as exploitation of enemy weakness but had devolved into attritional slugging matches against opponents who would not acknowledge their physical limitations. The psychological impact on German troops rippled beyond immediate tactical failures, as soldiers who had survived years on eastern and western fronts found themselves disturbed by the realization that they faced enemies capable of sustaining combat effectiveness under conditions that should have rendered them helpless. The Canadians had demonstrated something beyond normal military capability, a capacity for suffering and continued function that violated German calculations about logistics and combat power. By the end of Day 10, the German counterattack had failed completely, and Canadian forces resumed their grinding advance through Scheldt defenses that were crumbling under pressure that refused to relent regardless of cost. Supply lines had finally been restored, partially as engineers completed repairs to damaged routes, allowing emergency rations to reach forward units, whose soldiers consumed food with mechanical efficiency, born from bodies desperate for calories. Medical officers examining troops who had fought 10 days on empty stomachs documented physical degradation that should have produced combat ineffectiveness days earlier, weight loss averaging 20 pounds per man, vitamin deficiencies producing bleeding gums and skin lesions, and exhaustion so profound that some soldiers collapsed immediately after combat ended and slept for 20 hours straight. Yet these same men had continued fighting throughout the ordeal with effectiveness that had not only held defensive positions but continued offensive operations and defeated German counterattack by fresh troops. The accomplishment violated conventional understanding of human limitations, demonstrating that training, leadership, and psychological factors could sustain combat effectiveness beyond points where physical condition alone predicted failure. The Germans who had dismissed Canadian capabilities before the battle now filed reports acknowledging they had faced opponents whose determination exceeded anything their doctrine had prepared them to counter. The immediate aftermath of the 10-day ordeal saw Canadian units withdrawn from frontline positions for rest, and refitting that medical personnel insisted was essential to prevent permanent damage to soldiers who had pushed their bodies beyond sustainable limits. The men who staggered back to rear areas barely resembled the troops who had entered combat weeks earlier, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost significant muscle mass, their faces gaunt and eyes hollowed by exhaustion that went beyond simple sleeplessness to fundamental depletion. Medics working in casualty clearing stations documented conditions rarely seen outside famine or concentration camps: advanced malnutrition, organs beginning to fail from prolonged calorie deprivation, an immune system so weakened that minor infections became serious medical concerns. Several soldiers died in the days following relief, not from combat wounds but from complications of starvation their bodies could not recover from even after food became available. The butcher's bill for the Scheldt campaign would include not just those killed by German fire, but also casualties of hunger and exhaustion that claimed lives after the fighting ended. German analysis of the Scheldt campaign produced heated debates among officers trying to reconcile observed Canadian performance with established doctrine about logistics and combat effectiveness. The professional military consensus held that soldiers required adequate nutrition to function in combat, that hunger degraded capabilities in predictable ways, and that supply disruption offered effective means of weakening enemy forces without direct confrontation. The Canadians had demonstrated that this consensus was incomplete, that psychological factors and unit cohesion could sustain combat effectiveness beyond points where physical conditions suggested armies should cease functioning. Some German officers argued this represented exceptional circumstances unlikely to be replicated, that the Canadians had been lucky, or that German intelligence had overestimated the severity of their supply situation. Others recognized they had witnessed something more fundamental. Well-trained, well-led troops with high morale could endure hardships that would shatter lesser formations, creating force multiplier effects that complicated calculation of relative combat power based solely on material factors. The strategic consequences of Canadian success in the Scheldt extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories that had cleared the estuary and opened Antwerp to Allied shipping. The port that had sat useless throughout September and early October began receiving ships by late November, eventually becoming the primary logistics hub supporting Allied operations into Germany. The tonnage flowing through Antwerp dwarfed what could be delivered over the beaches or through smaller ports, transforming Allied logistics from hand to mouth, existence to abundance that allowed sustained offensive operations. This strategic victory had been purchased through Canadian sacrifice in fighting that had tested human endurance to its absolute limits. The 10 days without food represented only the most dramatic hardship in a campaign that had lasted weeks and cost thousands of casualties. But it symbolized the determination that had characterized Canadian operations throughout. Without that willingness to continue fighting regardless of conditions, the Scheldt would have remained closed much longer with potentially decisive effects on Allied operational tempo. Recognition of Canadian accomplishments came slowly and incompletely as contemporary attention focused on more dramatic operations, like the airborne assault at Arnhem or the American advance toward the German frontier. The Scheldt campaign received limited press coverage because fighting in flooded polders lacked visual drama compared to tank battles or airborne operations, and because Canadian contributions to Allied victory generally received less attention than those of larger coalition partners. Soldiers, who had starved for 10 days while defeating German counterattacks and clearing critical objectives, returned to a homeland where few understood what they had endured or accomplished. The institutional memory of the ordeal lived primarily within military communities where veterans shared experiences incomprehensible to civilians who had not experienced combat or the specific conditions of the Scheldt fighting. This limited recognition frustrated some who felt their service deserved greater acknowledgement, though most simply wanted to resume civilian lives without dwelling on memories better left buried. The long-term effects on survivors of the Scheldt campaign manifested in both physical and psychological damage that persisted for decades after the war ended. Bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits suffered permanent consequences as organs damaged by starvation never fully recovered, and immune systems weakened by malnutrition left men vulnerable to illnesses throughout their lives. The psychological trauma of fighting while starving, watching comrades die from hunger and exhaustion as well as enemy fire, and the close quarters, violence that had characterized the worst fighting created burdens that 1,940 seconds, medicine had few resources to address. Many veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and flashbacks triggered by hunger or memories of the Scheldt. Some turned to alcohol or isolation to manage psychological wounds their generation had been taught to suppress rather than treat. The cost of those 10 days without food and the broader Scheldt campaign would be paid not just in immediate casualties, but in decades of suffering by men who had given everything their nation asked and received wounds that never fully healed. The historical legacy of Canadian forces fighting 10 days without food during the Scheldt campaign occupies an ambiguous position in both military history and national memory. Professional military institutions studying the campaign recognized it as a demonstration of how well-led, well-trained troops could sustain effectiveness under extreme conditions that would break less capable formations. The case entered staff college curricula as example of morale and leadership partially compensating for logistics failures, though analysts emphasized that such performance could not be reliably expected or deliberately planned for in future operations. The specific circumstances that allowed the Canadians to function while starving included veteran troops with extensive combat experience, exceptional small unit leadership, strong unit cohesion built through shared hardship, and enemy that underestimated their determination. Attempting to replicate such performance with less experienced formations or weaker leadership would likely produce very different and far less favorable outcomes. Canadian national identity incorporated the Scheldt campaign into military heritage selectively, emphasizing strategic importance of opening Antwerp while often glossing over the brutal specifics of how the victory was achieved. The narrative of Canadians fighting without food for 10 days made occasional appearances in popular histories and commemorations but never achieved the prominence of more celebrated operations. This reflected partly the inherent difficulty of dramatizing a story about hunger and endurance compared to accounts of dramatic battles or technological innovations, and partly the Canadian tendency toward understated commemoration that avoided glorifying war's horrors. Veterans who had survived the ordeal sometimes expressed frustration that their accomplishments received less recognition than they deserved, while others felt relief that public attention remained elsewhere and allowed them to process traumatic memories privately without expectation of performing for audiences seeking inspiring war stories. The broader implications of the Scheldt ordeal extended into understanding of human performance under extreme stress and deprivation. Medical and psychological research in subsequent decades examined how soldiers had sustained combat effectiveness while starving, identifying factors that allowed continued function when physiological models predicted failure. The research highlighted importance of psychological resilience, social support from comrades, sense of purpose, and leadership that maintained standards, while acknowledging hardships honestly. These insights contributed to development of training programs emphasizing mental toughness and unit cohesion as force multipliers that could partially compensate for material disadvantages. Military organizations studying unconventional warfare and special operations, where logistics support might be unreliable or absent, incorporated lessons from Canadian performance into selection criteria and training regimens designed to identify and develop individuals capable of sustained function under deprivation. The German perspective on facing Canadians who continued fighting despite starvation evolved in post-war. Memoirs and histories as veterans reflected on experiences that had challenged their understanding of warfare. Some German officers who had fought in the Scheldt acknowledged they had underestimated Canadian capabilities and determination, recognizing that prejudices about colonial troops and assumptions about logistics had created blind spots in their defensive planning. Others rationalized the experience as exceptional circumstances or lucky breaks favoring the Canadians rather than fundamental miscalculation about enemy quality. The diversity of German responses reflected broader patterns where even direct experience sometimes failed to overcome institutional prejudices and doctrinal assumptions. The tendency to dismiss or rationalize unexpected enemy capabilities rather than seriously reassessing one's own understanding represented cognitive bias that affected military organizations on all sides throughout the war. The story of Canadians fighting 10 days without food during the Scheldt campaign ultimately illustrates principles about human capability, institutional culture, and the sources of combat effectiveness that transcend specific historical circumstances. Physical condition matters enormously in warfare, but psychological factors including morale, leadership, training, and unit cohesion can sustain performance beyond points where material models predict failure. Underestimation of opponents based on prejudice or assumptions creates vulnerabilities that competent enemies exploit ruthlessly. Small nations can produce military forces capable of achievements that exceed what their size or resources would suggest possible through focus on quality, realistic training, and development of institutional culture that emphasizes professionalism and resilience. These lessons remained relevant long after the specific battles ended, offering insights applicable across military and civilian contexts, where organizations face extreme challenges requiring sustained performance under adverse conditions. The Canadians who fought through the Scheldt while starving demonstrated not superhuman capabilities, but rather what ordinary humans could accomplish when properly led, adequately trained, and committed to purposes they considered worth extreme sacrifice. Their achievement deserves remembrance, not for nationalist celebration, but as testament to the extraordinary potential residing in people who refuse to accept that hardship justifies surrender. The hunger that should have broken them became instead another obstacle they endured and overcame, writing a chapter in military history that challenged assumptions about the limits of human endurance and the nature of combat effectiveness. Those men who fought on empty stomachs for 10 days earned something more valuable than medals or recognition. They proved to themselves and demonstrated to the world that determination and training could sustain capability beyond what any doctrine predicted possible, that the human spirit properly directed could overcome deprivations that should have rendered warriors helpless. That lesson, written in hunger and violence across the flooded polders of the Scheldt, remains their enduring contribution to understanding what soldiers can accomplish when everything except refusal to quit has been taken from them. Part concluida. 5.